No matter how hard you try, you cannot bury the truth. Her voice sliced through the grand showroom, reaching the glittering chandeliers above. For a brief moment, every carefully composed face looked frozen, petrified. Tonight, every mask will fall, every lie will shatter into dust. The murmurs died instantly. Only the ticking of the clock remained, as if time itself was bracing for what was about to come. Then, a single restless movement, a breath caught in someone's throat, and in the next moment, words were spoken that no one had expected, words that would change this night forever. The golden morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting restless patterns of shadow over Miss Eleanor Greaves' sitting room, where every object spoke of quiet elegance and meticulous order. A faint breeze stirred the embroidered doilies atop polished mahogany, bringing in the scent of rain-drenched roses from the garden beyond. Hallows Parish was a place where time moved with a measured grace, where the greatest disruptions were whispered scandals of missing heirlooms or secret rendezvous. But Miss Greaves, perched with effortless poise in her high-backed chair, knew that beneath the town's gentle lull, the undercurrents of something far darker often churned unseen. She lifted a delicate porcelain teacup to her lips, only to find the tea had cooled, abandoned the moment her sharp, ice-blue eyes fell upon the morning's paper. The headline stretched across the page like a wound. Disaster strikes midnight rail, engineer dead, questions unanswered. Her thin lips pressed together in the faintest semblance of displeasure. Her gaze flickered down to the grainy photograph, a monstrous wreck of steel and smoke, modernity reduced to a crumpled spectre in the mud. She had never trusted speed for speed's sake. There was something deeply unnatural about a world that moved faster than reason. Her fingers skimmed the printed list of casualties, then stopped. Edwin Thorne. She knew that name. Her mind, keen as the glint of a needle in candlelight, traced back over recent conversations. Yes, Lady Ashcombe had mentioned him at supper not a month ago, hadn't she? An ingenious man, but terribly agitated of late, she had murmured, her gloved fingers playing with the rim of her wine-glass. Always fretting over deadlines, over safety measures. Such a shame, really. Safety measures. That phrase settled in Miss Greaves' mind like a stone disturbing still waters. She had learned over the years not to mistake accidents for mere misfortunes, particularly when they involved men who knew too much. The article labeled it mechanical failure, a tragic, unfortunate event. But Eleanor Greaves was not in the habit of believing in unfortunate events. She set the paper aside with precise fingers, the faint ticking of the mantel clock marking her thoughts in even beats. Outside, a train whistle cut through the quiet morning air, a low mournful cry that sent a shiver of inevitability through her bones. She reached for her knitting, a simple grey wool piece, but her mind was already threading together something far more complex. The truth, like the finest strands of silk, had a way of unraveling for those who knew exactly where to pull. She had just placed down her knitting when the knock came, 2 firm raps, a pause, then a third, uncertain. The rhythm of a man hesitating between duty and fear. Rising, she smoothed the crisp folds of her skirt, and moved through the room with the practiced grace of a woman who had long mastered patience. The scent of bergamot still lingered in the air. As she pulled open the door, Albert Thorne stood before her, his suit well cut but crumpled, his tie slightly askew. He removed his hat, fingers clutching the brim just a fraction too tightly. "Miss Greaves, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are only intruding if I do not wish to let you in." Her tone was light, but her gaze sharp, assessing. She stepped aside. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold like a man stepping onto treacherous ground. The embers in the hearth glowed faintly, their warmth barely reaching Albert Thorne as he sat, shoulders hunched, hands clenched into fists on his knees. He was a man struggling to fit inside his own skin, as though grief had draped itself over him like an ill-fitting coat, heavy and suffocating. Miss Eleanor Greaves observed him with the quiet patience of a woman who had spent decades unraveling the secrets men tried to bury. Without a word, she poured him tea and handed him the cup, her delicate fingers steady against the trembling of his own. He stared down into the amber liquid, his throat working before he found his voice. "You've read the paper," she nodded. "Then you know."
"About your brother?"
He exhaled sharply, but it was not relief, more like the sound of a man bracing himself for impact. "They're calling it an accident, are they?" Her voice was light, but Albert looked up sharply, startled by her lack of the usual reassurances. "Yes," he said bitterly, "but it wasn't." She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me why." His fingers tightened around the porcelain, because Harvey knew that train inside and out. He designed half the systems himself. If something was wrong, he would have caught it. His voice was even, but his eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, told a different story. The raw edges of grief, yes, but something darker lurked beneath it. Miss Greaves tilted her head slightly, and yet the official statement attributes the crash to mechanical failure. A hollow laugh escaped him. "Of course it does. That's the easiest explanation, isn't it? A tragic accident, unfortunate loss, condolences to the family, and then the company moves on." His jaw tightened. "They won't investigate. They don't want to." She took a slow sip of tea. "And you do." His gaze met hers, searching, desperate. "I need to. Harvey told me something wasn't right. Deadlines being pushed, corners being cut. He didn't like it." "Did he name anyone?" Albert hesitated. "Not directly, but he mentioned Victoria Ramsay." He swallowed hard. "She oversees the project. Obsessed with speed, always pushing, never questioning whether it was safe." A faint breeze stirred the lace curtains, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain. Miss Greaves studied Albert carefully. His grief was genuine, but there was something beneath it, a tightness at the corners of his mouth, a flicker of something behind his eyes. He wasn't just mourning, he was afraid. "You believe he was silenced?" The words settled between them like a third presence in the room. Albert's hands clenched before he carefully set the teacup down, as if only just remembering it was fragile. "Yes." She reached for the folded newspaper beside her chair, smoothing it open. The wreckage stared back at her, twisted steel and smoke, progress reduced to ruin. She ran a fingertip lightly over the headline. "The gears are slipping," she murmured. Albert stiffened. "What?" "Nothing," she said, her eyes unreadable. He raked a hand through his disheveled hair. "Miss Greaves, I don't know what to do. MRC will bury this. If I push too hard, I could lose my job. But I can't just let this go." He swallowed. "I need help." Miss Greaves sat back, regarding him with cool blue eyes that had seen far more than most assumed. "Mr. Thorne, I am an old woman who enjoys her garden and her books." She let that settle before adding, "But I have always found that one need not shout to be heard. Sometimes, a whisper is enough to bring a whole house of cards tumbling down." She tapped the newspaper lightly. "You were right to come to me. I shall see what I can find." Albert sagged, as though some part of the weight pressing on his shoulders had shifted. "Thank you." Miss Greaves smiled, but it was a sharp thing, small and knowing. "Let's not thank anyone just yet, Mr. Thorne." She reached for her knitting, her fingers brushing the soft wool as her mind began to weave something far more intricate. "We have a great deal of work to do." In the dim glow of an old study, a solitary figure sat, Eliza Harcourt, a woman of quiet demeanor but piercing intelligence, often mistaken for nothing more than a lover of old books. But she knew that books were not just vessels of knowledge, they were doorways to stories hidden between the lines, waiting for the right eyes to uncover them. Before her lay a small time-worn diary, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages filled with intricate sketches, precise calculations and handwritten notes. It had belonged to the late Samuel Whitmore, a brilliant engineer who had perished during the final test run of a new high-speed locomotive. The official reports called it a tragic accident, engine failure, unexpected derailment, just another technical malfunction. But Eliza had never been one to trust official reports. She opened the diary, flipping through the pages until her gaze landed on the last entry. The gears are slipping. The truth is hidden inside the speed. Her fingers pressed slightly against the cover. This was not the frantic scrawl of a man in distress. It was a message calculated, deliberate. She turned more pages, absorbing the careful notations and technical blueprints that mapped out the inner workings of the locomotive. And then, tucked within the margins, a brief but chilling note caught her eye. "They say if I ask too many questions I'll be out of a job, but I know Victoria Alden is hiding something." Eliza had heard that name before, Victoria Alden, the project manager. A woman known for her ruthless ambition, determined to push groundbreaking innovations into the market at any cost. Whitmore had seen something, perhaps something Alden had wanted buried. Eliza's mind worked quickly, drawing threads together. This couldn't have been just an accident. Whitmore's final words hinted at something deeper. The truth is hidden inside the speed. Did he mean that the train's maximum velocity had been pushed beyond safety limits? Had someone intentionally ignored a critical design flaw? She rose from her chair, carefully closing the diary, feeling the unmistakable pull of a mystery unraveling before her. The next step was clear. She needed access to the confidential records of the Modern Transit Corporation, where the true story of this project was hidden. But this was only the beginning. She knew that when the truth surfaced, its impact would not be confined to one man's untimely death. It would shake the foundations of an entire industrial empire. Like a machine in motion, a system that seemed smooth on the surface, but beneath it, where no one was looking, the gears were slipping. And those who tried to stop it were often the first to be crushed. The train whistle howled in the distance, its mournful cry stretching across the autumn air, as Eliza Harcourt remained very still, absorbing what she had just uncovered. Then, with a quiet, deliberate nod, she reached for her coat. It was time to ask questions, the kind that had answers people preferred left buried. The cemetery at Ashford Hollow swallowed sound like an ancient beast, its iron gates standing solemn against the overcast sky, and the towering yew trees swaying with the whispers of long-departed souls. Even the wind moved cautiously here, rustling the brittle leaves that clung to gravestones worn smooth by years of rain and neglect. The funeral had been brief, almost perfunctory, the grief dampened by the suffocating presence of men in crisp black suits who stood like statues among the mourners. The company representatives had come, nodded their heads at all the right moments, and disappeared just as swiftly, as if their presence was a mere formality, not a reflection of loss. Eliza, standing at the edge of the gathering, observed Albert Whitmore, his hands clasped tightly behind him as the last shovelful of earth fell onto his brother's grave. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with something more than grief, something restrained, something he had not yet spoken aloud. When the murmuring villagers drifted away, their voices hushed with polite regret, she stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore," Albert turned, his face tight with an emotion he had yet to name. "Miss Harcourt," she laid a gloved hand gently on his forearm. "A terrible thing." He exhaled, his gaze flickering to the fresh mound of soil. "It is." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves curling through the spaces between them. She waited, knowing silence often did the work of loosening lips better than questions. Albert inhaled sharply, then almost involuntarily spoke. "He called me, the night before the crash." Eliza's posture remained unchanged, but her attention sharpened. Albert's fingers curled at his sides. "He warned me about the final test." His voice faltered, but he forced himself to continue. He was afraid. That single word settled between them like a weight, shifting the foundation of what had been considered an accident into something far more sinister. "Did he say why?" Albert hesitated before finally nodding. "Said they were pushing too fast, cutting corners. He didn't trust the numbers, the new parts, the speed they wanted." Albert swallowed, his voice dropping even lower, as if someone might be listening. "He said if something happened, it wouldn't be an accident. A crow cawed in the distance, breaking the thick silence between them. Eliza folded her hands, her expression composed, but inside, the pieces were beginning to shift into something far more troubling. A difficult thing to hear from one's own brother, she murmured. Albert let out a short, humorless laugh. I told him to refuse, to stop the test if he had to. But he said it wasn't that simple. His jaw tightened. He sounded resigned. Eliza studied him, then turned her gaze toward the retreating figures of the last of the company men, vanishing through the wrought iron gate. And yet, she said quietly, no one at the company has raised any questions. Albert's lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. They buried it fast, mechanical failure. No inquiry, no real investigation, just another unfortunate event in the name of progress. Her fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her handbag. How very convenient. She looked back at Albert, taking in the exhaustion lining his face, the restlessness that clung to him, a man suspended between mourning and knowing too much. I do believe, Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, that your brother may have left us a puzzle. Albert's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then I hope to God you can solve it, Miss Harcourt. She turned slightly, her gaze falling once more on the fresh grave. The wind stirred again, tugging at the edges of her coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already turning, shifting through the words, the warnings, the absence of real answers. Something had gone terribly wrong on that train, and someone wanted to ensure it stayed that way. The last of the mourners were dispersing, coats drawn tight against the creeping chill. Albert remained by his brother's grave, his posture stiff with the weight of something unspoken. But Eliza's attention had drifted elsewhere. Just beyond the main gathering, half shielded by the skeletal branches of a yew tree, stood a woman, tall, poised, a presence too carefully placed to be mere coincidence. Victoria Alden. Eliza's fingers curled ever so slightly around the edge of her handbag. She had been waiting for this moment. One night when the winds were restless and the moon hid behind a shroud of mist, Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat at her old mahogany writing desk, reading an aged letter over and over again. From the distant railway station, the eerie wail of a train whistle cut through the silence, sounding almost like a scream, a whisper of a mystery only she could understand. The hush of the night carried an unsettling presence, a secret buried for so long that even the air felt heavy with its weight. Somewhere in the shadows of that cursed station, the spectre of a crime still lingered, and Miss Whitmore was ready to uncover it. The next morning, as the town stirred beneath the bleak autumn sun, a small crowd gathered near St. Peter's Church, drawn together by yet another untimely death. The coffin was lowered into the earth with solemn precision, but the air felt wrong, thick with something unspoken, something waiting to be revealed. Muted conversations and cautious glances passed between the mourners, yet one man stood apart from the rest, silent but watchful. Richard Holton, the deceased's closest friend, stood stiffly, grief tightening his jaw, but there was something else in his eyes, something deeper than sorrow. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. The dead often leave behind messages. Sometimes all that remains is a whisper in the wind. Richard exhaled sharply, his voice raw. He called me that night. He wanted to tell me something, but all he said was, "This train will not stop." Eleanor's eyes darkened with intrigue. And then, Richard's fingers clenched at his sides, as if trying to suppress a truth too heavy to bear. Then, a scream. And nothing more. Eleanor's mind was already racing. This was no mere accident. Someone had orchestrated this death, someone who did not want the truth to surface. As the last of the mourners drifted away, murmuring empty condolences, her gaze landed on a woman standing apart from the rest, watching without mourning. Elizabeth Carmichael, poised, impeccably dressed in a tailored black coat, her expression unreadable, yet her presence spoke volumes. Richard noticed Eleanor's lingering stare, and whispered, "She's the most powerful figure on the railway board, and I don't think she's here just to pay respects." Eleanor's lips curled in a faint, knowing smile, or perhaps she's here to ensure everyone believes this was just an accident. Nightfall found Eleanor seated in her dimly lit study, flipping through the pages of an old journal, her mind weaving through the strands of a mystery that refused to rest. There was only one path forward, the truth buried with the man now lying beneath fresh earth. Was his death truly an accident, or was it a masterfully executed deception, one that had so far escaped the notice of everyone but her? The town may have settled into slumber, but Miss Eleanor Whitmore remained awake, chasing the secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The rain drummed a quiet rhythm against the window panes, a soft, persistent tapping that seemed to whisper secrets only the keenest ears could hear. Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat in the dim glow of her study, the fire casting flickering shadows along the bookshelves lined with neatly arranged volumes of law, history, and crime. A telegram lay open on the polished mahogany desk before her, its words stark against the crisp paper, position secure. Discretion advised. He allowed herself the briefest smile before folding the telegram, and tucking it into the drawer. The world outside may have been wrapped in the deceptive hush of a London evening, but she knew better. Beneath that quiet lay the undercurrent of something dangerous. By morning, the city was alive with its usual mechanical precision, but Eleanor's path was set. The corridors of the Halverson and Moore Financial Trust were rarely disturbed by the presence of someone like her, yet she walked through its imposing doors as though she belonged. A well-placed favor, an old acquaintance in the right position, and now she was precisely where she needed to be, inside the institution that held the key to a mystery she had no intention of leaving unsolved. A ledger sat before her, its pages heavy with records too neatly arranged, too meticulously balanced. Fraud, if done well, was an art, and someone had painted a masterpiece within these numbers. Her fingers traced the names listed within the columns, stopping at one she had seen before, William Dayton. A name that had surfaced too many times in whispers and rumors, a man who had vanished under the most inconvenient of circumstances. A man who, if her instincts were correct, had uncovered something within these very ledgers that had cost him his life. The sound of footsteps approaching made her slip the book shut with a practiced ease, her posture one of casual disinterest as the door to the records room opened. A woman stood there, poised, elegantly dressed, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity. Margaret Lane. A name with power, a name with reach. "You must be the new records assistant," Margaret said smoothly. Stepping inside, Eleanor merely smiled, the picture of polite efficiency, just ensuring everything is in order. Margaret's lips curled at the edges, but her gaze lingered a moment too long on the ledger Eleanor had closed. Suspicion veiled beneath polite indifference. This was no coincidence. Margaret Lane was no idle observer. She was watching, measuring, waiting. Eleanor met her gaze evenly, as if the game had not already begun. As Margaret turned away, Eleanor knew one thing for certain: whatever William Dayton had found before his disappearance, she was now one step closer to uncovering it. And someone, somewhere, was already deciding whether she had gotten too close. A thick fog rolled through the London streets, curling around lampposts like ghostly fingers as Margaret Halstead stepped out of the cab, her gloved hands smoothing the lapel of her coat. The towering facade of Halverson Financial Group loomed before her, its cold steel and glass exterior, a stark contrast to the warmth of the polished mahogany offices hidden within. This was no ordinary institution. It was a fortress of influence where numbers were wielded like weapons and fortunes were unmade with the stroke of a pen. Margaret, or rather, Mrs. Eleanor Ward, adjusted her spectacles, adopting the air of a woman who had spent years balancing ledgers and filing reports, a presence so unassuming that she would be all but invisible. But invisibility was a choice. She stepped through the revolving doors, the faint scent of fresh ink and leather-bound contracts filling her senses as she approached the security desk. Name? The guard barely glanced up from his register. Eleanor Ward. "I believe I'm expected." The young man skimmed the list, then, with a perfunctory nod, slid a temporary badge across the counter. Records department. 4th floor. Miss Sterling will meet you. Pinning the badge to her coat, Margaret offered him a pleasant smile, the kind that would be forgotten in seconds. Such efficiency, she murmured. He blinked, unprepared for politeness in a place where time was money. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, and she stepped inside, ensuring her movements were neither too hesitant nor too assured. Suspicion arose from extremes. A mild-mannered middle-aged widow in search of honest work was the safest mask she could wear. The lift ascended smoothly, the numbers glowing faintly as they ticked upward. 4th floor. A hush settled over this level, the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine running beneath the surface. Frosted glass offices lined the corridor, names etched in neat gold lettering, while the rhythmic clatter of typewriters echoed from unseen rooms. A woman awaited her, Vera Sterling, tall, poised, with sharp green eyes that catalogued Margaret in an instant. Her presence exuded the quiet authority of someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, perhaps even literally. Mrs. Ward. The voice was warm, but the undertone was unmistakable. Assessing, Margaret extended a gloved hand, her grip firm but not overconfident. Yes, dear. Though I do hope I won't get lost in all these corridors. Vera's lips curved slightly. We all do at first, but I suspect you'll find your way just fine. She turned, leading Margaret down the hall. Records is a quiet place, but sometimes that's where the most interesting things happen, wouldn't you agree? Margaret allowed a small smile. Oh, I always find that to be true. Vera cast a sidelong glance at her, something flickering behind her professional exterior, recognition perhaps, or simply curiosity. Well, she said lightly, let's get you settled in, shall we? Margaret followed, each footstep soft against the polished floor. The air here was different, too still, too precise, as though the walls themselves were listening. She had stepped into a game where the rules were unwritten, but the stakes, life-altering. And somewhere, unseen, someone was already watching. The scent of old paper and ink hung in the air as Eleanor Ward stepped into the dimly lit records office, her gloved fingers brushing over the spines of countless files stacked neatly along the walls. The weight of bureaucratic routine pressed in around her, engineering schematics, personnel files, documents that told one story on paper and concealed another between the lines. The long wooden desk near the center of the room bore the marks of years of use, a typewriter resting at its center like a sentinel of forgotten truths. Settling into her chair with practiced ease, Eleanor adjusted a stack of ledgers, her eyes scanning the room without appearing to. The rhythmic ticking of a clock on the far wall merged with the steady hum of ventilation, a backdrop of calculated monotony that made secrets all the easier to bury. But Eleanor knew better. The most damning truths were never written in bold ink but whispered in hesitation, in numbers that didn't quite add up, in names that appeared too many times in the wrong places. As she flipped open a ledger, her ears attuned to the sounds beyond the door, footsteps, hurried conversations, the weight of urgency pressing into the otherwise ordered silence. Then voices. 2 men passed by, their conversation a hushed exchange laced with tension. If we miss this deadline, it's over for us. You know how this works. Keep your voice down, we don't want another incident. A pause, like Roland. Eleanor's hand stilled over the ledger. Roland, a name that had surfaced in the company's records too frequently before abruptly disappearing. Officially he had resigned, but rumors whispered of something less voluntary, something tied to discrepancies buried deep in classified documents. She reached into her handbag, retrieving a small leather notebook, and in careful strokes wrote Roland, incident, anomalies, urgency, who's next? The tension in the air was growing thick, and she could feel the weight of something unseen shifting in the company's corridors. Pushing the ledger aside, she rose, smoothing her coat as she made her way toward the cafeteria. Unlike the grand dining halls of upper management, The cafeteria was an unassuming place of quiet efficiency, white marble tables, streamlined chairs, a space designed for brief sustenance rather than lingering conversation. But it was here, amidst trays of uninspired meals, that the undercurrents of power played out in glances, whispers, and half-finished sentences. Eleanor took her place in line, her gaze directed at the display case but her attention elsewhere. Through the reflection in the glass, she watched as Celeste Duval entered. Celeste did not simply walk into a room, she owned it. Dressed in midnight blue, every fold of fabric a testament to deliberate perfection, she exuded a confidence that was neither forced nor performative. It was the quiet assurance of someone who dictated outcomes rather than responded to them. Her polished heels barely made a sound as she crossed the room to where a man in a steel-gray suit was already seated. Ethan Graves, a senior strategist, a man whose job wasn't just to predict outcomes but to manipulate them. Eleanor shifted slightly, pretending to examine a selection of pastries as she listened. Celeste leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "The conference is next week. We need control. There's no room for another failure." Ethan stirred his coffee, his jaw tightening. Roland was a warning. "We can't afford another one." Eleanor's grip on her handbag tightened. A warning, not a resignation, not a departure, a warning. Celeste's expression didn't change, but there was something sharp in her eyes, something calculating, and the loose ends, handled. Make sure of it. She lifted her cup, her lips curving into a poised smile as though they had just discussed something as mundane as a quarterly report. Eleanor turned slightly, catching the faintest glimpse of Celeste's reflection in the polished metal of the counter, poised, untouchable. For now. Eleanor Ward sat poised, her fingers wrapped around the fine porcelain of her teacup, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold calculation in her mind. To any observer, she was the picture of quiet composure. A woman in control, deliberate in every movement, but beneath that poised surface, tension coiled like a serpent, unseen yet ever present. She was a woman used to winning, accustomed to maneuvering through the intricate games of power and secrecy, but tonight, the stakes were shifting in ways that made even her wary. The Records Archive was a world apart from the gleaming modern offices of the Armitage Rail Consortium. Here, the silence was thick, the air tinged with the scent of old paper and ink, the hum of fluorescent lights, a soft, constant backdrop. This was a place where order reigned, where every piece of information was accounted for, at least on the surface. But Eleanor had learned long ago that true power was not in the papers stacked neatly on desks, but in the documents hidden away, locked behind steel doors, waiting for the right hands to claim them. By late afternoon, the last of the clerks had filtered out, their goodbyes fading into the hush of the empty archive. Eleanor had remained, sorting through invoices with an air of practiced disinterest, her gaze flickering occasionally to the far side of the room. Cabinet B17, marked restricted access, and inside it, Project Ironclad, confidential. It had been there for weeks, unnoticed, untouched, a secret buried in bureaucracy. To the untrained eye, it was just another file among thousands, but Eleanor was not untrained. She had spent years deciphering the language of power, of deception, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that the most dangerous truths were always hidden in plain sight. Pushing back her chair, she stood with the unhurried grace of a woman following a well-rehearsed routine. Each step was measured, precise, as if she were merely tidying up. Her fingers brushed the cool metal handle of the cabinet, ready to test its resistance, when a voice, smooth yet edged with warning, sliced through the quiet. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Eleanor turned, unruffled, to see Lucian Hale leaning casually against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the dim overhead lights. He was a man who made it his business to be where he wasn't supposed to be, a presence that carried more weight than his quiet demeanor suggested. Eleanor adjusted her spectacles with a calm that didn't reach her pulse. How unfortunate, she mused. I despise interruptions. Lucian's lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in his expression. That makes two of us. For a long moment, they studied each other, an unspoken battle of wills unfolding in the silence. Then, without another word, Lucian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. It glinted faintly as he turned it between his fingers, offering not just access, but an understanding. "Let's say," he murmured, "I have my doubts about the official reports." Eleanor's curiosity sharpened. She stepped aside, watching as he fit the key into the lock and turned it with a quiet, deliberate click. The cabinet door swung open, revealing a thick file waiting inside. Lucian withdrew it, flipping through the pages with the ease of a man who had done this before. He set it down on the desk between them, his fingers lingering on the cover before he exhaled, slow and measured. "I've seen the figures," he said in a hushed tone. "Funding discrepancies, emergency acquisitions, security overrides. The numbers don't add up." Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the file before she opened it. Material acquisitions, budget approvals, authorizations with signatures that should not have been so easily granted. The sums were staggering, the urgency, unnatural. She turned another page, schematics. A blueprint for something unfamiliar, something masked beneath layers of obfuscation. But what struck her most was not what was there, it was what wasn't. There were no identifiable suppliers, no recorded inspections, just a paper trail designed to lead nowhere. "This isn't just about money," she murmured. Lucian's jaw tightened. "No, it's not." He glanced toward the empty corridor, his voice quieter now. "And we're not the only ones looking." The air in the archive shifted. The silence no longer felt routine. It felt weighted, as if something or someone was waiting. By the time the consortium's corridors emptied, Eleanor was already moving. The engineering sector was an entirely different world at night. The echo of daytime activity had faded, leaving behind a heavy expectant stillness. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale reflections on the polished floors. Shadows pulled at the edges where security cameras blinked like mechanical sentinels, their quiet vigilance masking the deeper secrets within. Eleanor moved carefully, the soft soles of her shoes ensuring she made no sound. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who belonged exactly where she was, even though she had no business being anywhere near the secured labs. Lucian's access card was warm in her gloved hand, the weight of its risk pressing against her palm. The door to the restricted engineering lab loomed ahead, featureless except for a simple key card panel. No elaborate security, no biometric scans, just a single point of access, as if no one had ever expected a breach to come from within. She slid the card through, a brief pause, a hesitation in the system. For a fraction of a second, the silence felt too complete. Then the scanner flickered. Green. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the handle. This was it. Whatever lay beyond this door was no longer mere suspicion, it was proof. But proof of what, and just how far someone was willing to go to keep it hidden, remained to be seen. The door clicked open, a whisper of metal against metal, and Eleanor Ward stepped inside, her presence dissolving into the vastness of the engineering lab. Overhead, exposed steel beams loomed like the ribs of some great mechanical beast, and the air held the sharp tang of oil and ink, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of the corporate offices above. Long drafting tables stretched in precise rows, blueprints and schematics pinned against the walls like a gallery of secrets. The heart of Armitage Rail's latest project pulsed here, in quiet hums of machinery and the scrawled warnings of engineers too cautious to speak aloud. Eleanor moved between the tables, her gloved fingers tracing the edges of the scattered documents, her gold-rimmed spectacles catching the dim light. Her gaze landed on a blueprint, its margins inked with red annotations, frantic, hurried, unstable at higher velocities, requires further testing. The words felt like an echo from a ghost long buried. Harvey Thorne had written something similar in his journal, a warning drowned beneath official reports. If he had known, Who else had? And how much had been ignored? A faint rustling outside sent a prickle up her spine, footsteps, measured, deliberate. Not the hurried scuffle of a late working technician, but something slower, more intentional. Eleanor exhaled, stepping into the deeper shadows beside a tall cabinet. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door, followed by the low murmur of a voice on the phone. The new assistant, keep an eye on her. If she digs too deep, we'll have to handle it. A pause, then sharper. No mistakes this time. Eleanor's grip tightened on the edge of the blueprint. The door cracked open slightly, and for a long moment, the silhouette of a figure loomed against the dim hallway light. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, before the door clicked shut once more and the footsteps faded. She didn't move. Not yet. Only when the air settled did she finally exhale, smoothing the fabric of her sleeve. They already suspect me. Then it meant one thing. She was getting close. Eleanor stepped into the corridor, moving with careful purpose, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. The silence here was different, no longer the ordinary hush of an empty workplace, but something denser, watchful, like unseen eyes followed every measured step. She adjusted her spectacles, resisting the urge to glance over her shoulder. To an observer, she was merely an assistant returning from an errand, nothing more, but she knew better, and so did they. A voice cut through the quiet. "You're working late, Miss Ward." She stopped. Ahead, in the dim glow of the emergency lighting, a man leaned casually against the junction of the hallway. Dennis Griffith. His sleeves were rolled up, ink and oil staining his fingers, as if he had been buried in work for hours. His dark hair was Toller's, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, betrayed none of the weariness his posture suggested. Eleanor's fingers twitched at the handle of her handbag. She hadn't heard him approach. "We're all quite busy here," Griffith continued, pushing off from the wall, his easy demeanor at odds with the pointed glint in his eye. "It's always interesting to see a new face. How are you settling in?" She smiled, polite, unreadable. "Everyone has been very kind, though the accident, such a terrible thing." Something flickered across his expression, gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully measured nod. "Yes, a tragedy. But these things happen in cutting-edge research. Unfortunate, but we move forward." His voice was steady, but Eleanor caught the way his jaw tensed, the careful way he chose his words. Too polished, too rehearsed. "Of course," she murmured. "But I do wonder if it was truly an accident." The silence stretched taut between them. For the briefest moment, his composure wavered, just enough for her to see the sharp edge beneath it. Then smoothly, effortlessly, he recovered. His lips curled into something that was almost a smile. "You've been here a day, and already forming theories." His tone was light, almost teasing. She let out a soft chuckle. "Oh dear me, no. Just an old woman's curiosity." Griffith studied her for a long weighing moment. Then motioning down the hall, he said, "Come." The lab was immaculate, yet there was an unsettling stillness in the air, like the silence before a storm. Miss Evelyn Hartley adjusted her gleaming spectacles, her sharp eyes scanning the blueprints spread across the desk. This wasn't just a design, it was the final prototype from Mervyn Technologies, a revolutionary rail system that promised speed but harbored something far deadlier. Her fingers paused over a hastily marked note. "Threshold unstable, fatal margin exceeds safety parameters." She ran her hand over the ink, as if measuring the pulse of a dying secret. Was this an oversight, or a deliberate cover-up? A faint sound broke her concentration. Someone was outside the door. Holding her breath, she glanced at the frosted glass panel. A tall silhouette stood there, unmoving, predatory in its stillness. "Yes, that woman," a muffled voice murmured. "She's getting too close. If necessary." A pause, measured and cold. "Remove her." Evelyn inhaled quietly, steadying the sudden hammering in her chest. The door clicked shut. They weren't coming in yet, but they would. She was sure of that. Adjusting her spectacles once more, She picked up the blueprint. If this was a game where lives were disposable, she was going to play, but on her own terms. The corridor outside carried the weight of unsaid things, as if the walls themselves had heard too much. Her footsteps were deliberate, the gait of someone simply finishing their work shift. But her mind was now racing with a deeper question: who orchestrated this, and against whom? She barely turned the corner before a voice stopped her. "You stayed late, Miss Holloway." Dennis Crowley stood there, an engineer with a suspiciously knowing gaze. Ink stains smudged his fingers, as if his thoughts, like his work, were permanently etched in the mechanics of deception. "Long night in the drafting room." His tone was light, but the words were as sharp as a scalpel. Evelyn offered a practiced smile. "Just reviewing old records. That train accident." For a fraction of a second something flickered across Dennis's face, then it was gone, replaced by his usual unreadable smirk. "Yes," he murmured. "Unfortunate, but every innovation requires sacrifice." The words slithered down her spine like ice. "But what if that sacrifice was deliberate?" she asked, her voice carrying the tremor of calculated innocence. Dennis's smile didn't falter, but she saw the minuscule shift in his posture. He knew. "Are you developing new theories?" "Just the curiosity of a woman in the wrong place at the right time." She adjusted her spectacles again. "Then come," he gestured toward the hallway. "Let's discuss over tea." The cafe was steeped in a strange warmth. Coffee, cigar smoke, and whispers woven into the air like threads in an unfinished tapestry. Conversations here hovered, waiting to be swallowed by the noise of grinding beans and clinking cups. Evelyn sat in a secluded booth, swirling her tea, its reflection darker than her thoughts. Across from her sat Albert Crane, a man who didn't just look afraid, but haunted, carrying the weight of his brother's death like a shadow he couldn't shake. He placed a worn-out diary on the table like a confession. "I found this hidden away," he said quietly. "It belonged to my brother." Evelyn flipped it open. The handwriting was neat at first, structured, but as she turned the pages, it unraveled into erratic scribbles, the descent of a man who knew too much. Braking system compromised on purpose. She sucked in a slow breath and turned another page. Test failure expected, disaster necessary for future investments. Evelyn's fingers curled. This wasn't a flaw, this was a conspiracy. A carefully crafted catastrophe where human lives were pawns in a game of corporate greed. "They made it a spectacle," Albert whispered, his voice shaking. "My brother saw through it, and that's why they silenced him." Evelyn let a pause settle between them, then took a slow sip of her tea. She was no longer just a researcher, she was stepping onto a battlefield. "So what do we do?" Albert's hand clenched the table, seeking resolution. Evelyn met his gaze, her smile quiet, but resolute, the kind only a person ready to dismantle a lie could wear. "We expose them." Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the unraveling conspiracy inside the dimly lit cafe. But soon the world would know, the hunt had begun. Morel had never been one to let sleeping secrets lie. The cafe was behind her now, its warmth and whispered conspiracies dissolving into the restless hum of London's morning. Trolley cars clattered along their rails, the sharp voices of paperboys cut through the air, and the steady rhythm of polished shoes echoed against the cobblestones. But Morel had always preferred places where the world moved a little slower, where the weight of secrets could settle without being lost in the current of daily commerce. She took a seat on a weathered bench in the park, her gloved fingers resting over the worn leather of Harvey Thorne's journal. It was more than just a collection of notes, it was a ledger of impending reckoning. Across from her, Albert Thorne stood at the path's edge, his nerves fraying at the seams, his fingers working against the brim of his hat with an absent, desperate rhythm. "We have enough," he muttered, voice taut with urgency. "His notes, his suspicions, it's all here. We take this to the authorities now, and they have to listen." Morel barely moved, Just a slight lift of her hand, but it was enough. Albert fell silent. Her gaze flickered toward two passing women engaged in idle gossip, their laughter like a veil over the city's true darkness. The moment they drifted out of earshot, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of unshaken certainty. "The truth must stand on solid ground, Mr. Thorne." "Not sand," Albert exhaled, frustration curling his fingers into fists. "How much more certain do we need to be?" His voice broke slightly, the grief behind it raw. "My brother saw the sabotage, he wrote it down." His words faltered, emotion catching his throat, "and they killed him for it." Morel's expression remained composed, but her eyes, sharp beneath the gold rims of her spectacles, carried a glint of something unreadable. "And if we go to the authorities now, what do we have? Notes? Suspicions?" She turned to face him fully. "Or do we give them something undeniable?" The realization struck Albert then. He had underestimated her. He had thought her merely a seeker of truth, but she was something else entirely. "They'll come after you," he said, his voice quieter now. Morel's lips curved slightly, amusement flickering there for just a moment. That would be their mistake. A trolley bell clanged in the distance. The breeze stirred the hem of her coat as she rose, fastening the clasp of her handbag with quiet resolve. "We still have work to do." She turned and strode back toward the city, toward Mervyn Rail Consortium, toward the den of polished ambition and concealed threats. Albert watched her go, then turned his gaze toward the restless autumn leaves. The wind had changed. A storm was coming, and Morel was walking straight into it. The records office held the stale hush of a place abandoned by life, but not by purpose. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp-edged shadows against rows of neatly stacked filing cabinets. It was late, too late for anyone to be here except the determined or the dangerously curious. Evelyn Fitzroy stood near Victoria Ramsay's desk, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping a single sheet of paper like a relic pulled from the wreckage. Her sharp brown eyes darted toward Morel, who stood composed watching. "I saw it," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely louder than the humming lights. She tapped the memo with a single finger, the motion betraying the tension humming beneath her skin. "They didn't want a safety inspection. It's right here." Morel stepped forward, her gloved hand reaching for the paper with deliberate care. The note was brief, clinical, but beneath its simplicity was something ice-cold. "Special bonus for accelerated results. Ensure no mechanical inspection occurs before the test run." Morel's fingers tightened slightly. "A bonus for acceleration," she murmured. So they counted on success. Or perhaps, she let the thought linger, dark and unfinished. Evelyn swallowed. "Harvey knew," she said, her voice rough with realization. "He saw something, maybe an adjustment to the braking system, maybe a part swapped out at the last moment, but he knew." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture neither woman wanted to see, but could no longer ignore. This was never about efficiency. It was about orchestrated disaster, a profitable failure, a sacrifice wrapped in corporate ambition. Morel exhaled, folding the memo neatly between her fingers, tucking it away like a loaded weapon. "Then it's time we start making them nervous," she said, her voice calm, yet carrying the edge of something lethal. The game had already begun. Now it was their turn to make the next move. Zara Whitmore had always believed that the truth was like an ember buried beneath the ashes, patient, waiting for the right breath of air to ignite. The hotel lounge behind her was steeped in hushed conversations and the clinking of glassware, but its warmth did little to soften the chill of what she now carried in her mind. The streets of Edinburgh were alive once more, the morning fog peeling away as carriages rumbled over cobblestones and hurried footsteps echoed against the stone facades. Yet, Zara preferred the quieter corners, the places where one could sit still and watch the world move around them. She settled onto a weathered bench at the edge of Prince's Street Gardens, fingers tightening around the delicate clasp of her leather handbag. Inside, the document stolen from Hawthorne Shipping's private offices felt heavier than mere parchment, its ink a testament to the conspiracy that had cost 2 men their lives. Across from her, Daniel Ashford stood taut with tension, his knuckles white against the brim of his hat. "This is enough," he said, his voice edged with urgency. "We take this to the authorities now, and they—" Zara lifted a gloved hand, a movement so subtle yet commanding that Daniel fell silent. She turned slightly, listening to the murmured gossip of a passing couple, their words light with talk of theater and supper invitations. "Not here, not yet." When they drifted out of earshot, her voice was calm but unyielding. "We need more than suspicion, Daniel. We need something undeniable." He let out a sharp breath, sinking onto the bench beside her. "My brother was afraid," he murmured. "He found the missing ledger entries, he saw the names, he wrote it all down, and they killed him for it." Zara remained composed, eyes fixed on the cityscape beyond. "And if we go now, what do we give them? A handful of notes? A theory?" She turned to meet his gaze, her blue eyes glinting like steel beneath the morning light. "Or do we give them a noose so tight they have no room to wriggle free?" Daniel hesitated, something shifting in his expression, understanding perhaps, or reluctant admiration. "They'll come after you," he warned. Zara smiled faintly, as though the thought amused her. "Then they'll regret it." A distant clock chimed the hour. The wind stirred the last of the golden autumn leaves, sending them spiraling along the path as Zara rose, her resolve set. "We have work to do." And with that, she turned toward the city once more, toward the grand offices where fortunes were made, and fates were sealed in ink and whispered promises. Daniel watched her go, the weight of the storm pressing against the horizon, dark and gathering. Zara Whitmore was walking straight into it. The records hall had the solemn hush of a tomb, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above the rows of towering cabinets. The air smelled of old paper and dust, of secrets long buried but never truly forgotten. Evelyn Barrett stood rigid near the heavy oak desk, her breath uneven as she clutched a yellowed memorandum between trembling fingers. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice barely more than a thread of sound. "They ordered it, Zara. Right here." She tapped the paper, the gesture sharp, betraying the strain in her hands. "They didn't just ignore the safety checks, they ensured they wouldn't happen." Zara stepped forward, taking the paper with deliberate care. The note was precise, its wording unassuming, bonus incentive for expedited completion. No external audit before the final assessment, a reward for cutting corners. A silent assurance that the ship would either succeed or perhaps more conveniently, fail. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Harrison knew," she said, her voice raw. "He must have seen something. A flaw in the design, a miscalculation. Maybe an intentional one." Her breath hitched. "They knew, Zara. They knew and they let it happen." Zara's grip on the paper tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. "The question is why?" Evelyn glanced toward the locked cabinet near the far wall. "If there's more, it'll be in there." But Zara's instincts were honed by years of unspoken danger, of reading the shift in a room the way a sailor reads the tide. The air had changed. Something unseen, something wrong. She set the paper down carefully, smoothing its edges as if it had never been disturbed. "Not tonight." Evelyn's eyes widened. "But if suspect you, Evelyn, this ends here. If they suspect both of us, we will never get another chance." A beat of silence, then a slow, reluctant nod. Zara straightened, adjusted the folds of her coat, and lifted her handbag. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "We will be very careful." Evelyn hesitated. "And if we aren't?" Zara's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then we will be very, very clever." The stillness of the records hall seemed to deepen as they parted ways, the distant creak of the building settling the only sound beyond their breath. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The corridor stretched long and narrow, the polished floor reflecting the sterile overhead lights. The evening shift had bled away, leaving behind only the hollow echoes of industry. Zara walked at an unhurried pace, her every step measured, her every movement precise. She had perfected the art of appearing exactly where she belonged, even when she didn't. And then Miss Whitmore. The voice was smooth, deliberate, the kind that could command boardrooms and negotiations with equal ease. Zara turned. Standing at the end of the hall, poised as if she had been waiting, was Eleanor Ramsay. The glow of the overhead lamps caught the sharp angles of her face, the subtle gleam of the pearls at her throat. Her midnight blue dress, immaculate and severe, clung to her frame like armor. She smiled, but it was a blade wrapped in silk. "I do hope you're finding your role fulfilling," Eleanor said lightly. "We value loyalty here at Hawthorne Shipping." Zara clasped her hands over her handbag, her voice a perfect echo of polite indifference. "Quite happy, thank you. Everyone has been very accommodating." "Good," Eleanor murmured. "We like our people to feel at home." She stepped closer, just enough for her next words to land exactly where she wanted them. "Of course that requires a certain level of trust, wouldn't you agree?" Zara tilted her head, considering. "Trust is a valuable thing." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, but something in her eyes flickered, a predator testing its prey. Then she leaned in just slightly, her voice lowering to a velvet whisper. "Some people don't keep secrets well." She paused, let the weight of the words settle. "And they pay for it." Zara's fingers brushed the clasp of her handbag, a slow and deliberate movement. She met Eleanor's gaze, steady and unwavering. The threat had been delivered. Eleanor straightened, smoothing a hand down the front of her dress. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Whitmore." Then, without another glance, she turned and disappeared down the corridor, her heels tapping softly against the tile. Zara remained still, listening to the echo until it faded. Then, with the same unshaken grace, she exhaled and resumed her path. The game had changed. If she continued, she might become the next accident. But as she stepped through the doorway into the cold night air, her resolve remained firm, because now she was certain, she was very, very close. A dim overhead light flickered as Eleanor Graves adjusted the thin leather gloves on her fingers, her eyes fixed on the aging blueprints spread before her. The ink had faded, but the intent remained sharp. This train had never been meant to succeed. Across from her, Dr. Simon Hale exhaled sharply, his gaze darting toward the heavy steel door of the archives. "We shouldn't be here this long," he murmured, voice tight with unease. Eleanor's lips curled slightly, unbothered. "The truth doesn't keep office hours." Beside them, Daniel Frost, a man who had spent more years covering up corporate sins than exposing them, clenched his jaw. "If they find us, then we'll make sure they regret it." Eleanor interrupted, sliding a thin folder toward him. The contents were damning. Supply orders that didn't match shipments, safety reports altered before approval, signatures forged with a precision that suggested someone high up was desperate. "We need more," she decided, her voice measured. "Physical proof. If we don't show them the cracks in the foundation, they'll never believe the house is about to collapse." Hale pushed his glasses up, hesitating. "You mean the prototypes?" Eleanor nodded. "The modifications, the sabotage, the failures they've hidden." Silence settled between them, thick as the dust in the archives. Finally Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "The engineering floor is locked down after hours. Then we won't go through the front door." Eleanor stood smoothing the creases from her coat. "If we do this, there's no turning back." Hale hesitated, then rose with a slow nod. "Then let's make it count." The night swallowed them as they slipped through corridors thick with the scent of oil and metal, the air charged with the hum of machines now dormant. The workshop stretched ahead, vast and shadowed, its skeletal structures looming like monuments to unfinished ambition. Eleanor moved with practiced ease, her fingers trailing over cold steel as she navigated through the labyrinth of half-built locomotives. She crouched beside a control panel, flicking open the access hatch with a swift movement. A single circuit board gleamed under the dim glow of her flashlight. The serial number had been altered, its original inscription sanded down and rewritten. A shiver of satisfaction coursed through her. "Here," she whispered, handing it to Hale. "This is what kills the train." He turned it over in his hands, his expression darkening. "This isn't incompetence, it's intent." But before he could slip it into his bag, a sound echoed, a footstep, deliberate and slow. Eleanor turned, her pulse steady. A figure emerged from the gloom, his tie loosened, his face worn with secrets he had carried too long. Julian Marks, a man who had built his career keeping people like them quiet. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said softly. Eleanor tilted her head, her smile never reaching her eyes. "So are you, Mr. Marks. The difference is, I play to win." The vast dimly lit archive room hummed with the faint buzz of aging fluorescents, their flickering glow casting restless shadows across the endless rows of rusting metal cabinets. Dust curled through the air like whispers of secrets long buried, waiting for time to swallow them whole. At the center of it all, seated at a narrow wooden table, one meant for clerks who never asked too many questions, was Eleanor Graves, her sharp gaze fixed on the folder Evelyn Holloway had just set down with a little too much force. Across the room, Daniel Wren paced with restless energy, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his weathered coat, jaw clenched tight. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Eleanor tapped her fingers lightly against the table, the sound impossibly loud in the hush. "They want to erase it all," Evelyn murmured, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "The records, the transactions, the modifications, everything. I checked this morning, files are vanishing. If we wait any longer, there won't be anything left." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Financial reports won't mean anything to the public. They don't care about numbers, they care about impact." Eleanor's expression didn't waver. "Then we show them," she said simply. Evelyn frowned. "How?" Eleanor laced her fingers together, her voice calm, assured. "Photographs of the altered components, blueprints proving deliberate failure. We don't just tell them the truth, we make them see it." Daniel stopped pacing, glancing between them. "That means getting into the engineering lab." Evelyn stiffened. "That's impossible." Eleanor merely smiled. "Not impossible," she corrected, "just rather difficult." A heavy pause settled over them. Then Evelyn picked up her pen, resolve hardening in her eyes. "Then we'd better do it right." The engineering workshop was a cathedral of steel and silence, its towering machinery casting jagged shadows beneath the cold gleam of emergency lamps left burning through the night. By day, it was alive with the roar of industry, sparks from welding torches, the relentless pounding of metal. But now it was something else entirely, a hollow, breathing thing full of secrets. Eleanor moved soundlessly between the rows of equipment, the small camera in her gloved hand steady as she raised it and pressed the shutter. A white-hot flicker, then darkness. The engine before her was massive, its frame half-assembled, its exposed inner workings a labyrinth of metal veins and circuits. Stamped onto one of its core components was a single word: substandard. Eleanor's mouth pressed into a thin line. She took another photo before sliding the camera back into her handbag. With careful precision, she reached into the open panel and pried loose a small circuit board, tilting it under the dim light. The serial numbers had been scratched away and reprinted, an intentional replacement, a deliberate failure. As she slipped it into her coat pocket, a noise cut through the stillness, a footstep. Her breath stilled. From the shadows emerged a figure, Daniel Griffith. His coat was unbuttoned, sleeves pushed up, hands loose at his sides. He looked exhausted, as though the weight of something unbearable had been pressing on him for too long. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then quietly, he said, "If you're looking for proof, you won't need much more than that." Eleanor didn't move. She had spent a lifetime reading people, and Daniel had the look of a man who had finally reached the breaking point. He ran a hand through his hair. "They forced me into it. he murmured. "The board, Ramsay. They knew I was drowning in debt. They told me if I didn't go along, they'd ruin me." His voice cracked. "But I never wanted anyone to die." Eleanor stepped closer, voice gentle but firm. "Then help us stop this." Daniel hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded blueprint, fingers trembling as he held it out. "This is everything," he said hoarsely. "They didn't just cut corners. They built the failure into the design." Eleanor unfolded the document beneath the pale glow of a hanging lamp, her pulse steadying as she read the damning annotations. The sabotage was undeniable. Daniel swallowed. "They'll come after you." Eleanor tucked the blueprint into her bag, her eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. "They can try," she murmured. The grand showroom of the NovaCorp Rail Corporation gleamed under the weight of excess, chandeliers burning with cold fire, polished marble reflecting the eager faces of investors and officials. At the center of the stage stood the scaled model of the revolutionary high-speed train, its sleek, steel frame gleaming beneath the spotlights. The air thrummed with anticipation. Reporters clutched notepads, pens poised like weapons. Executives stood in neat, calculated rows, their smiles sharp as polished glass. And then there was her. Victoria Ramsay moved like a woman who owned the world, her midnight blue dress crisp, heels clicking against the stage floor as she approached the microphone with the confidence of a coronation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice silken, poised, "tonight we unveil the future of transport." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and then a rustle, a flicker of movement, a shift in the air. The first sign of disturbance was subtle, a row of reporters exchanging glances, murmuring. Then the distinct click-click of camera shutters going off at the wrong moment, and then a voice, "I believe it's time for a different perspective on progress." The room stilled. The voice was crisp, quiet, edged with unshakable certainty. Not the voice of a meek assistant. Not the voice of a woman who had spent her life tucked behind ledgers and forgotten records. This was the voice of Eleanor Graves. And she was standing at the foot of the stage, her gloved hands resting neatly on the clasp of her handbag, her presence a ripple through the carefully maintained order. Security hesitated, unsure. Victoria's fingers tightened around the microphone, her practiced smile faltering at the edges. "I beg your pardon." Eleanor stepped forward. Behind her, Evelyn and Daniel were already in motion, files being uploaded, evidence being handed to reporters, the blueprint of destruction already making its way into the hands of the public. The moment was shifting, tilting, and then it collapsed entirely. The hush that followed wasn't one of awe, it was the silence before disaster, and Eleanor Graves, standing calm amidst the wreckage, only smiled. The grand exhibition hall of the Renshaw Aeronautics Corporation was a shrine to ambition, gleaming steel fixtures, glass walls stretching into infinity, and a curated sense of opulence that masked the quiet hum of deception beneath. Tonight, industry leaders, government officials and journalists had gathered to witness the unveiling of the company's latest innovation, the Stratos Falcon, an aircraft promising record-breaking efficiency. The air buzzed with anticipation, the weight of expectation, hanging thick over the sea of tailored suits and glittering champagne flutes. At the center of the room, a polished stage bore the imposing figure of Reginald Stokes, CEO and master architect of the empire, his silver-threaded hair pristine, his presence exuding the effortless control of a man who had never lost, until now. Because standing at the foot of the stage, with an air of quiet certainty, was Marianne Locke, her gloved hands resting atop her handbag, her silhouette small yet unshakable against the marble backdrop. When she spoke, her voice was smooth as silk, deliberate as a knife slipping between ribs. "Your pardon, Mr. Stokes," she said, her tone as calm as a lake undisturbed by wind. "I am Marianne Locke, and I am here to expose a most unfortunate conspiracy." A ripple of unease spread through the room. A reporter straightened, sensing blood in the water. A low murmur passed between two investors, their polished smiles faltering, but Marianne remained undisturbed, her gaze steady as she opened a slim folder with methodical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," she continued, her words slicing through the stillness, "this company has orchestrated one of the most insidious acts of corporate deceit in modern aviation. Tonight, I present to you the truth buried beneath the gloss of industry." A hush fell. The room moments ago, a well-oiled machine of pleasantries and pretense, had turned brittle. "Lawrence Halloway was murdered," she said simply, "because he dared to unveil the truth." Someone gasped. The name was familiar, a former engineer at Renshaw Aeronautics, dead in a supposed accident. A tragic loss, a life mourned in press releases, then conveniently forgotten. But now the name was resurrected, a spectre looming over the gathered elite. Reginald Stokes' expression did not shift, but something in the stiffness of his posture betrayed him. Marianne withdrew several sheets, holding them up for the press to see. "Here," she continued, "are the falsified safety reports. Engine components deliberately downgraded to reduce manufacturing costs. Financial records showing concealed payments to regulatory officials to suppress inspections." Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, pens scratching furiously, and these, she revealed a series of photographs, are images of the compromised fuel injection systems, altered to function for a fraction of their intended lifespan. Structural weaknesses, intentionally built into the design to save a few $1 million. A sharp laugh cut through the growing tension, harsh, unnatural. "Reginald Stokes, this is absurd," he said, his voice cool but edged. "These accusations are baseless, and frankly, insulting." Marianne tilted her head slightly, considering him with an almost academic curiosity. "I'm afraid," she said, "that the facts disagree with you." The words settled over the room like a suffocating fog, and then a new voice. "It's true." A tremor ran through the assembled crowd. A figure stepped forward, hands trembling at his sides, his face drained of color. Douglas Linwood, a lead engineer, a man who had, until this very moment, remained loyal to the company line. His voice wavered, but the confession spilled forth like water bursting through a crumbling dam. "They forced me into it," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "The board, Stokes, they knew I had debts. They threatened to ruin me if I didn't comply." He exhaled shakily. "But I never wanted anyone to die." A gasp rippled through the hall. For the first time, Stokes' polished veneer cracked, his expression darkening into something colder, sharper. "You fool," he hissed under his breath. But it was too late. A man in uniform, a government investigator, silent until now, stepped forward, his presence carrying the weight of authority. "These claims warrant immediate action," he declared, his voice a gavel striking down. "The Renshaw Aeronautics Corporation will answer for these allegations." The room erupted. Executives whispered in frantic, urgent tones. Investors looked as though they had swallowed something bitter. Reporters bombarded Marianne with questions, cameras flashing in bursts of relentless truth-seeking. But she did not move. She merely watched as the edifice of deceit crumbled around them. In the chaos, Reginald Stokes took a single step back. He had lost. Marianne Locke, ever the quiet architect of truth, adjusted the clasp of her handbag. It was over, and everyone knew it. Outside, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, their echoes bouncing off the towering glass walls of Renshaw Aeronautics. The scent of champagne and expensive cologne now mingled with something else: fear, uncertainty, the unmistakable staleness of reputations unraveling. And in the center of it all, Stokes stood motionless, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of truth. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, their polished shoes clicking against marble as they approached. One stepped forward, his voice calm, rehearsed, the voice of a man well versed in delivering the inevitable. "Stokes," he said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice." He did not resist. He did not protest. But as they led him through the murmuring crowd, past the reporters, past the investors already murmuring about damage control, his gaze found Marianne's. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not defiance, recognition. And then he was gone, swallowed by the inexorable march of justice. The Renshaw Aeronautics Corporation had built itself on power, innovation, and unshakable prestige. But now it had crashed. Near the edge of the room, Albert Halloway, brother to the murdered engineer, stood watching, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His shoulders squared with the exhaustion of a man who had waited too long for justice. Marianne Locke turned, her work complete. The truth had landed, and there was no turbulence strong enough to stop it now. A hush fell over the grand halls of the Wellington Aerodynamics Corporation as Eleanor Graves, composed yet unwavering, stepped forward. The air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and the distant hum of machinery, progress in motion, or so they claimed. But Eleanor knew better. She adjusted the lace cuffs of her gloves before speaking, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that beneath the gleaming exterior of this empire lies a foundation of deceit." A murmur spread, the low rustle of alarmed whispers and shifting bodies. At the head of the long conference table, Winston Hale, the company's revered CEO, sat stiff-backed, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood. "This is absurd," he bit out, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Eleanor remained unshaken, unfurling a set of documents from her handbag. "Blueprints, purchase orders, falsified safety reports," she announced, placing them down with a deliberate thud. Each one a testament to the lengths taken to cover up the fatal sabotage of Flight 309. Gasps rippled through the room. A journalist at the back scrambled for his camera, while an executive shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the nearest exit. "This," she continued, lifting a grainy black and white photograph, "is a compromised turbine, its integrity purposefully weakened to ensure structural failure mid-flight." The room erupted. Winston Hale slammed a hand onto the table. "You overstep, Miss Graves." But before he could continue, a frail voice broke the din. "She's telling the truth." All eyes turned toward Charles Hayworth, the company's chief engineer, his face pale as though every secret he'd harbored had finally rotted from the inside. "They pressured me," he confessed, his voice unsteady, "threatened my family if I refused to sign off on those modifications. I can't live with it anymore." The weight of his words sent shockwaves through the room. Winston Hale's face twisted with fury, but he did not speak. The Ministry of Transport official, silent until now, stood with authority. "A full-scale investigation will commence immediately," he declared. Reporters surged forward, flashbulbs igniting like electric firecrackers. The elegant empire Winston Hale had built was crumbling around him. The man who once dictated the fates of so many now sat motionless, his mask of control slipping. Outside, sirens wailed, their echoes reverberating against the glass walls of innovation turned scandal. As officers stepped in, their polished boots clicking against the marble, Hale barely managed to summon his final words. "You'll regret this," he murmured, not in anger but in acceptance of the inevitable. Eleanor met his gaze with quiet finality. The truth has a way of catching up. As Hale was led away, handcuffs snapping shut like the final page of an ill-fated chapter, Eleanor merely adjusted the clasp of her handbag. It was over. The city swallowed her in its pulse, neon lights flickering against rain-slicked streets, yet she did not linger. By morning, the papers would howl with scandal, heads would roll, and the world would move on. As always, she would step away from the wreckage, her work complete, her presence already dissolving into the shadows where secrets could never truly hide.